Way before Europeans ever arrived on their shores, West Africa was home to some incredibly powerful and wealthy trading kingdoms. I'm talking about empires like Songhai and Benin, which built enormous wealth on things like gold, copper, and all sorts of regional trade. But in the 1500s, everything began to change. A new brutal demand from across the Atlantic Ocean would explode the trade in enslaved people, forcing millions on a horrific journey and permanently reshaping not just the continent, but the entire world. Okay, let's dive into exactly how this transformation happened.
So this is the big question, right? Because let's be clear, slavery and other forms of bondage have existed in pretty much countless societies for thousands of years. But what started happening in the 1500s was different. It was different on a whole new level. The sheer scale of it, the economic engine driving it, and of course, the devastating human consequences.
To really get what changed, you have to look back. In ancient Greece and Rome, for example, enslaved people were often prisoners captured in war. Same thing in the Aztec Empire. War captives or even criminals could be enslaved. And in Africa itself, long before the 1500s, there was a well-established trade in goods and enslaved people that went across the Sahara Desert. But the system that started to take shape in the 16th century, this Atlantic system, it was a whole different beast.
Now, before we get to that massive turning point, it's so important to understand the societies that were already thriving in West Africa. We're not talking about undeveloped lands here. Not at all. These were complex civilizations with rich cultures, powerful governments, and dynamic economies, all deeply shaped by their unique environments.
You know, they say geography is destiny, and you can really see that here. In the huge open grasslands of the savannah, farming and raising cattle allowed for these large, powerful kingdoms to really flourish. But then, down in the dense, wet rainforests closer to the coast, different crops like yams and kola nuts grew, which led to totally different kinds of communities and trade networks. These two environments created very distinct, very powerful societies.
And it was from these environments that two major powers emerged. Up in the savannah, you had the massive Songhai Empire, which basically controlled all the trade that flowed along the Niger River. And then down near the coast, right on the edge of the rainforest, was the incredibly influential Kingdom of Benin. Let's zoom in on each one for a second.
The Songhai Empire was an absolute powerhouse. It was expanded through pure military might under rulers like Sunni Ali, but it was also this incredible center of Islamic scholarship and learning, especially under Askia Mohammed. And cities like Timbuktu and Jenne, they weren't just trade hubs. We're talking about world-renowned centers of knowledge with huge libraries and universities.
Now, the Kingdom of Benin had a different kind of structure. It was all centered on the authority of its king, the Oba, who held both political and spiritual power. The Edo people were fantastic traders and fierce warriors, but what they are probably most famous for today, and for good reason, is their incredible art. These intricate sculptures in bronze and ivory, they're considered masterpieces of world art.
So you've got these two powerful, totally distinct kingdoms going about their business, engaged in their own regional trade and politics, but then a new force shows up on the coast, and it brings with it a demand that would kick off a devastating and world-changing new era.
Okay, this next point is absolutely crucial to understanding what happens next. At this time, the idea of a single, unified African identity just didn't exist. People didn't see themselves as African. They saw themselves as Edo or Songhai or as a member of another specific group. Your loyalty was to your own people and your own ruler, not to the continent. And that fact becomes critical in how this trade was able to expand. And here's the catalyst. As European powers, starting with Portugal, began colonizing the Americas, they needed a massive, and I mean massive labor force for their plantations: sugar, tobacco, cotton. They turned to Africa, and their insatiable demand for labor would completely warp and transform the smaller-scale slave trade that already existed.
And this chart just lays it out so clearly. The scale, it just explodes, going from regional and limited to massive and intercontinental. The basis for it also shifts, from being a consequence of war or debt to a brutal commercial enterprise that becomes more and more based on race. And of course, the destination changes completely, from nearby regions like North Africa to a one-way, harrowing journey across an entire ocean to the Americas.
This new Atlantic system was built on the forced transportation of human beings. And at the very heart of it was a journey so horrific it has its own name: the Middle Passage.
The Middle Passage. It was the second leg of what's often called the triangular trade. It's the part where millions of Africans were kidnapped, sold, and forced onto ships for that unimaginable voyage across the Atlantic. Millions. We'll never know the exact number, but historians estimate that over 12 million men, women, and children were forced onto these ships. It's a number so vast, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around the individual human tragedy behind every single one of those numbers.
The conditions on these ships, they were hell on earth. People were packed into spaces so tight they couldn't even stand up. Disease spread like wildfire. Food and water were scarce, leading to mass starvation. And on top of it all, brutal, horrific violence was just a constant reality. For millions, this journey was a death sentence.
And for those who survived, the ordeal was far from over. As the source material puts it, survivors suffered lifelong trauma and forced separation from family and homeland. They arrived in a so-called New World, completely stripped of their freedom, their family, their language, their entire identity.
The consequences of this trade were profound and permanent, and not just for the individuals who suffered, but for entire continents. This system didn't just end on the shores of the Americas, it left a lasting legacy that literally reshaped the entire world. The impact on Africa itself was catastrophic. The constant warfare, which was actively encouraged by the European demand for enslaved people, combined with the loss of millions of the youngest and strongest members of society, it destabilized kingdoms, shattered economies, and left a legacy of political turmoil that would endure for centuries.
Ultimately, when you step back, you realize this story is a vital part of our shared global history. The 16th century was a true turning point, a time when the connections between continents grew stronger than ever before, but often at an unbelievable human cost. This brutal trade fueled the economic growth of Europe and the Americas, but it was built on the destruction of African lives and entire societies.
And that really brings us to our final thought. This isn't just ancient history that's over and done with. The economic, social, and racial dynamics that were set in motion over 400 years ago didn't just vanish. So the question we're all left with is this: how do the echoes of this 16th century transformation still shape our world today?